our topic today is limiting access, as you can see there. And if you were on the webinar last week, you know that we covered managing both sides of a sale in a single transaction and pipeline, so managing your dual-sided transactions in one transaction. So there'll be a bit of overlap with that because that is so core to limiting access. You know, you're essentially limiting access to one side or another depending on what's appropriate. So we'll cover some of those things briefly, but there'll be a lot more that we'll cover as well. Okay, let's get started here. Let me go open pipeline. So naturally we're going to start at permissions, right? Because when you set a user's permissions, you are specifying what you globally, and I say globally a little bit loosely, I'll tell you why in a second, want them to be able to do throughout the system, right? So you've got to set that part up first, and then we'll dive a little more granularly into what they can do on specific transactions and the like, okay? So let's hop into this user here and take a look at the permissions section. And I was going to highlight specific features that are important to limiting access or granting access, etc. But honestly, each of them is so critical to how you craft what you want the agents, and I'm talking about agents to start. We'll talk about admins in a minute, but mostly, typically what you're doing is managing the access that the agents have. But anyway, each of these items is so critical to just designing exactly what you want the agents to be able to do, when you want them to do it, etc. So I can't really highlight any one because they're all so important, whether it's creating transactions, changing the agents, changing the transaction status, which we'll get into a little deeper in a moment. Any of these admin level permissions, as is implied, are absolutely not appropriate to give to agents. So those are out, but continuing on, uploading docs, assigning docs to transactions, etc. So you can see how if you give any one of these to an agent, it will manage exactly what you want them to be able to do in the system, okay, globally. And a moment ago I said I'm using that term loosely. You can set these globally, meaning throughout the system, or you can do it by office. And when I say or, you've got the ability to set up multiple locations, which can be physical locations or groups or teams, however you want to segment your team, really. You can create separate locations for that. And if you've got any questions about that at all, please feel free to reach out to us or check out our webinar. Actually, under our recordings, there's one called, our very first one actually, Managing Teams, that'll outline exactly how to set that up so that you can really segment users' permissions within locations. Okay, so again, you've got the ability to grant permissions by location, or you can give them to all the locations or to just one location and not the rest, or certain ones in certain locations, etc. So it allows you to really fine-tune exactly what someone should do and on which transactions, meaning which locations those transactions are in. Okay. Okay, so permissions set that basis for what they can do generally. Okay. So let me, before I leave permissions, let me go over to the admin settings, which is here, admin settings, to get to our company settings. There are a couple of settings on here that I wanted to highlight that also help you define what an agent can see. And that is allowing actually see or do. So this one in particular, allowing agents to change transaction status to closed, terminated, and expired. That's critical if you want an admin only to be able to basically close those transactions, okay, or to set them to an inactive state. And notice, by the way, you've always got these hovers, which I'm sure you know by now, to give you details about how to set up any of these permissions, either here or on that user profile when you're looking at the permissions, so you know exactly what you're granting there. And then the other one I wanted to mention back over on the settings page is to hide completed tasks and transaction checklists. And that allows you to suppress when tasks are completed and an agent actually an agent or an admin, doesn't matter, goes to that transaction. Those tasks will be hidden by default, reducing clutter. for the agent. And that's a huge deal. In addition to talking about these suppressions or this ability to craft what the agent sees, it's just as important for security purposes in some cases as it is to just reduce that clutter. The less they see, the easier it is to use the system. The less they see that's not relevant to them, right? You want them to obviously see information that they need to act on or that's relevant to them. But if it's not, reducing that makes the experience easier for them, makes them more likely to do it, and in general just makes everything more seamless. Okay, so double benefit there. All right, so those are the company settings. So now let's dive over to a transaction. We've got our global permissions set up for the agent. Let's say that particular agent. So now now that we're on this transaction, let's add an agent to a transaction. Because despite the permissions, if I want an agent to be able to see a transaction, I've got to add them to that transaction. Okay, so let me go ahead and edit a transaction. I'm going to add Jane Smith, right, as an agent on the transaction. And by doing so, now Jane can see this transaction generally. In other words, when she goes to her transactions list, it'll appear here if it's active. She can search for it and find it and go to it, right? So it doesn't mean that she can see everything on this transaction. You've got some ability to suppress certain things on this when they're not relevant to her. For example, and this gets back to that whole dual managing dual sides comment that I made earlier. This is where you limit what an agent can see on a particular transaction, whether it's because you've got both sides of the transaction or not. Just again, limiting what they're able to do or see on this transaction. So, and the 5 main areas that exist for doing that on a transaction relate to the docs, limiting which docs they can see, the tasks, so limiting which tasks they can see, the notes or emails, being able to make those private, and then the received messages that are sent to this transaction. That's the 4th one. And then the 5th one is there are certain options that you've got for crafting which fields an agent can see and or edit on a transaction. Okay, and some of them happen automatically. Some of all of this happens automatically. So first I'm going to go over those things that you need to actually deliberately set in order to limit that access. So first I mentioned docs, right? Whenever a doc is added to a transaction, it must get a permission category. And that permission category is what tells the system who can view that doc. So you've got an opportunity there to limit who sees that doc. So here, what I've got, I'm in the process of uploading some docs here. You can see that I've got the ability to set exactly which group of people, which side, which type of, which role of person can see this particular doc, right? And I can even hover over these little people over here to see exactly which agents will have access for this particular doc if I select that option, okay? Set this as a listing and leave this visible to listing agents, set it as sale, visible to both sides, etc. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set that as a listing and upload those. So that's the first way. Second way, as I mentioned, is being able to set visibility on the tasks. So I can here say that I want it to be visible to one side or the other or both. Maybe I want it to only be visible to admins, etc. Again, that whole ability to reduce the clutter as well. So they may not be security issues in this case, but again, only an agent only seeing those tasks that they need to work on is a pretty big deal for making things as efficient as possible. Okay. And ideally, you want to set this visibility at the checklist template level, not right here on the transaction. But you've got the option to do it both ways. If visibility gets set after it's already on the transaction, it still works just as effectively. But again, more efficient for you as an admin to set that at the checklist template level. Okay. Third way is, let me hop back over to the main page here. Oh, hi, I'm near there. So third way to limit access is with the notes. So whenever you're sending a note or email, you've always got the ability to make this note private. And if you do, or an agent does, that will make that note visible only to that person that's doing it, the recipients and admins or staff. Okay, so some privacy there. The other area is received messages. Whenever messages are sent to a transaction, only the sender and admin staff can see it. Okay, so if an agent sends a message to a transaction and then another agent is viewing this page, they will not see that message. Okay. And then the last area on the transaction is by field. So the main one that agents cannot see, so if you needed to add any private information, you would put it into the admin info field. Right here. Right, only visible to admin staff. So if I put something in here that I don't want agents, if I don't want agents to see something, I put it in here and it will not show up for agents, only for admins. Okay. There are also several fields that agents can either only enter when they're empty or enter when they're creating the transaction. In some cases, they can't even see the information later. Actually, is that true? Actually, I think they can still see it all. It's mostly editing it, not being able to edit it once it's been entered. But all of those rules are here over on our article, and I refer to this actually regularly because it's a bit of information to remember exactly who can do what and at what points. But it's a little elaborate. Basically, it's smart enough to know when it's appropriate for an agent to make changes or not, and it follows those rules. So if the transaction is in a particular status, and if the person is an agent, they can edit certain fields. If not, they can't. And there are certain fields that they can never edit, only admins can, etc. So if you're ever curious about why an agent can't edit something or can't view something, head over to this article. It's called "Why Can't Agents Change Some Fields on Their Transactions?" And it'll explain exactly why and when they can do certain things. Okay. And then the last edit area is here. Whenever and this is only if you subscribe to the commission and reporting module. If you do, then once a CDA is created, there are certain fields here that cannot be edited because the CDA is based on them. So you would need to actually delete that CDA in order to be able to edit those again. Okay. And so now let's hop over real quickly back to a user profile to talk about editing or managing admin permissions and limiting that access. Generally, you're typically limiting access for agents, but there will be occasions where you've got to set up your admin and define exactly what access that admin should have. Typically, you're doing that at setup and then you're done with it. Whereas for agents, it can be ongoing, again, per doc and per checklist task, etc. But for admins, again, typically you set up their access and then it stays that way. It'll occasionally change, but generally you're just setting it up here at this level. And here's where the admin level permissions do come into play. You can give them the ability, you can obviously give them all the permissions that agents have as well, but then you've also got the ability to give them view all transactions for this location, which also happens to be the permission that tells the system that this person is admin staff. Okay, so if you want to make someone a location admin is what it's called, you would give them this permission here. And then there's some other admin level permissions like reviewing docs, marking them as entered if you have the entered feature turned on, deleting docs, fully managing checklists, etc. Okay, and again, by not having these checked, that limits their access to that. Okay, and then the only other area I was going to mention, and it's actually the opposite of limiting access, and just so that you're aware that it is the one area that where in the system where you cannot limit access, and that is the reference page. On the reference page here, anyone who's an active user under Manage Users can view this page and download these whatever docs you've uploaded here, etc. So there are no limitations on this page. Everything else has limitations that either the system has set based on permissions that you've set. For example, you can't view the unreviewed page if you don't have review permissions. You can't assign docs if you don't have the assign permission, etc. Okay. So those are the many ways that you can craft and limit access throughout the system so that agents and admins can view what they need to and not view or edit what they should not.